Hello, this is Angela with Parker's Permaculture. It is a very warm and sunny day here in Portland, Oregon. In fact, it's the hottest part of the afternoon. I had meant to sit out in my squash patch and film out there today because I want to talk about cucurbits, but it is way too hot and sunny. And after this, I'm gonna go see a friend that I have not seen since before the pandemic began, and I don't want to get all hot and sweaty and gross. So I'm gonna hang out here in the shade and talk to y'all about the cucurbit family. Now, the Cucurbitaceae is a family that includes cucumbers, melons, watermelons, summer squash, winter squash, and pumpkins. We all grow them. They're ubiquitous in the American garden, much beloved and highly productive and highly nutritious. They contain a lot of vitamin A and a lot of vitamin C. They're really good for you. However, there's a lot of misunderstanding that surrounds these vegetables, even though they're commonly grown in our garden. So I want to talk today about the 8 distinct species of cucurbits that we grow and enjoy in the garden. But before I get there, I think it's really important to pause and talk about a biological concept that we need to understand if we're going to grow cucurbits, and that is how cross-pollination works. I made a video on it last year. You may have seen it, you may not have, but I'm going to expound upon it a little bit more today. So when we are talking about growing our squash or our melons, I think it's really easy to draw some erroneous assumptions and to get a little bit confused about growing them. That's totally understandable. The plants look really similar. They have a similar growth habit, similar leaf structure, and more importantly, a similar flower structure. Cucurbits produce a flower that is 5 fused petals called a corolla, and they tend to be a yellowy orange in color and very upright in their growth habit, and they all look really similar. So you might think, these blossoms look a lot alike. I bet my melon can cross-pollinate with my squash. That actually can't happen because they are separate species, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. So I see folks posting in gardening groups where they say, I have this weird looking squash or this weird looking melon in my garden. I'm worried it's because I grew my cucumber too close to my melon, or I grew a cucumber too close to a winter squash and they have cross-pollinated and formed a hybrid. So that's not actually how cross-pollination works. Okay, so let's throw out an analogy here I've used multiple times. Should I get pregnant, my uterus will not take on the genetic and physical characteristics of my partner. However, my offspring will. They will be our shared offspring and carry genetic material from me and from my partner. It's no different with our squash. So when you have a squash that you're growing this year, the pollen of a male flower over here is transferred via a pollinator, probably a bee, over here to this female plant and deposited on the female plant and pollinates that flower. The fruit that is produced is the swollen ovum of this female plant, much like my uterus. The swollen ovum carries the genetic material and genetic characteristics of that plant. The seeds inside that squash, those will carry the hybridization or mixing of the genetics of both this male plant over here and the female plant. So when you have a weird looking squash in your garden, it is not because you grew it too close to another squash. Other things may be going on, and we'll talk about that later, but hybrid characteristics are not expressed in the squash of this year's plant. They are expressed if you grow out the seeds and see what happens to next year's squash. Next year's squash will be the mix of the parents. So I hope that clears that up a little bit. Now, what happens if you grow your cucumber too close to your squash and you save the seeds and grow them out next year? Will you get a hybrid? No, you won't, because they are 2 distinct species. So the definition of a species requires that 2 distinct individuals be able to have genetically viable offspring. They be able to have the ability to reproduce together. And that just doesn't happen with cucumbers and melons, or cucumbers and squash, or even different kinds of squash that are different species. And we'll get to that in a second. So don't worry, you can plant your cucumbers as close as you want to your cantaloupe, and it won't mess up this year's fruit, and it won't mess up next year's fruit either. What happens is when you grow two varieties in the same species that are genetically distinct, for example, a buttercup squash and a banana squash, which are both the same species, those will produce seeds if you grow them out next year that will carry traits of both of the parents. And that's an experiment you can conduct if you want to. So if you are growing a variety of squash and you want to preserve the characteristics of the parent, you have a butternut squash and you're growing lots of other squash around it, and you want to make sure that it will come true from seed next year, you can hand pollinate and then tape the flower closed, and that way you know you can save the seeds, because the only pollen that got into that female flower was the pollen you put there by hand, and then you taped it closed to keep pollinators out. You also can grow your squash or melons of the same species but different varieties at least 100 meters from each other. However, I don't tend to rely on that method because bees could travel up to 3 miles. So I tend to rely on the hand pollinate and tape method when I'm saving my sweetmeat squash, what have you. So now that we understand how cross-pollination works, and we know that we don't need to worry about growing two different kinds of cucurbits right next to each other, it won't mess up this year's fruit, let's talk about what are the different kinds of cucurbits that we can grow and how are they distinct from each other. So let's start with Cucumis sativus, which is the cucumber. Now, Cucumis sativus comes in many varieties you can only grow in the home garden. We all know what a pickle looks like. They're pretty common and universally consumed in the American diet. However, we also can get at the grocery store the English hothouse cucumber. There's not much else in terms of diversity. There are dozens and dozens of varieties you can grow at home that have a fantastic array of shapes and shades of green and yellow and different flavor profiles. I particularly like the lemon cucumber. I've been growing it for about 20 years. It's a nice round little cucumber that, while it can be a little prickly on the outside, has a really lovely fresh flavor. So next on the list is Cucumis mellow, and this is the melon family. And when I say melon, I mean the musk melons and the cantaloupes. So while the seeds may look similar to a cucumber seed, this is an entirely different species, and you can safely grow a melon next to a cucumber knowing it won't impact the flavor or characteristics of this year's fruit, but it also won't impact the seeds if you want to save them. So you can grow your melons, save your seeds, and replant them, and know that next year's fruit will not take on the characteristics of a cucumber because they cannot cross-pollinate. So if you're growing muskmelons or cantaloupe, Cucumis mellow, in your home garden, and you find that when you harvest them, the flavor is really strong and nothing like a cantaloupe from the store, which is picked incredibly underripe and shipped a very long distance, don't be surprised. The flavors that exist within the cantaloupe family and muskmelon family are rich, strong, diverse flavors and really enjoyable. Americans unfortunately suffer from a dampened palate, a palate that is acclimated to really weeny flavors, for lack of a better word. We don't eat strong flavored foods here, mostly because our foods lack the nutrition, and they're often not picked at peak ripeness, so we don't get the full expanse of the flavor profile. So if you're growing melons in your garden and you find, wowee, this is a strong flavor, it should be. A musk melon is a musky fruit, and it has a strong flavor. So give your palate time to adjust, and you'll find that you really can acclimate to that stronger flavor and come to enjoy it, and realize we've been missing out in the American diet, in the industrial food diet. We have been missing out on the huge array of flavors that we could be experiencing every day in our diets. Now, if you're growing cantaloupes and muskmelons in the Pacific Northwest, you may find, as I do, again, if we have cooler summers, they just don't mature the really large varieties. Stick for the diminutive varieties. There are lots of small ones that are meant to be eaten by one person in one sitting, and they do a really good job of maturing. I'll list in the description a couple of varieties that I grow consistently and find that do very well. You can grow those little melons even if you live in a cooler, short season climate, because they don't need the time and the heat to mature all the way. If you find that your melons taste much more like a cucumber, you're picking them too early, and perhaps your season isn't hot enough to get them to really ripen up and sweeten up. Now you may be wondering, Angela, you talked about muskmelons and cantaloupes. What about the watermelon? Well, watermelon is Citrullus lanatus. It's actually not even in the same genus as all these other cucurbits we're talking about. Same family, not same genus. Do not worry, your watermelons will not cross-pollinate with any of the other melons, will not cross-pollinate with your cucumbers, and watermelons can actually be really easy to grow from seed and save the seed and have them come true year after year if you're only growing that one variety. Now, I don't grow any large watermelons. I have tried a few of the Russian varieties, which are supposed to produce better in a short season, and I've had really limited success. I feel like they need so much babying, and I'll maybe get 1 or 2 melons out of it, that I would just rather grow squash, and I'd rather grow some of those smaller varieties of cantaloupes and set myself up for success. Okay, so now let's get to my favorite, the squash. I've recommended in the past Amy Goldman's book, The Complete Squash, if you want to research varieties of squash for the home garden, heirloom rare varieties. Fantastic book. But let's talk about the 5 species of domesticated squash. There are probably, if I had to hazard an estimation here, probably about 30 species of distinct squash that grow in the wild. 5 of them have been domesticated. Let's start with the 2 unusual ones that most home gardeners don't grow. Gyrosperma, and that is the cushaw. Keep in mind, not the cushaw melon, but the cushaw squash. It's not really well grown, but if you grow it in your garden, know that it's pretty darn easy to grow it with other pumpkins and save the seeds, because it is a distinct species, will not cross-pollinate with your other squash. So not too many people grow it here in the United States, but that is a domesticated variety. Called Physifolia because the leaves resemble a fig. And this is grown not only for the greens, which are edible, the seeds, which are edible, and the flesh of the squash itself. So there are several different varieties. It tends to be grown in very hot climates, and I have never grown them in my garden, but there is the fig leaf gourd and the black seed squash, which are 2 of the more common varieties. Now that we've tackled the 2 more rare kinds of domesticated squash, let's talk about the big 3. And I'm sorry if I get a little bit excited. I absolutely love winter squash. Just a staple of my diet, and love growing them, love the look of the plant, love the flavor, love the diversity, love everything about winter squash. So let's start with Cucurbita muscata. This is one that has a smaller number of distinct varieties. The most commonly grown one is butternut. One of the reasons that butternut is so frequently grown in the home garden is because it's really easy to save the seeds. Because we don't grow many other Cucurbita muscatas in our garden, you know that the butternut will come true from seed every year. There are a few other kinds of domestic varieties, including the Long Island cheese, that are Cucurbita muscata. The other reason that butternuts are commonly grown is because Cucurbita muscata is far more resistant to squash vine borer than any of the other cucurbits. So if you live in an area where you're having a hard time growing winter squash because squash vine borers are a plague on your garden, try growing butternut squash, or if you can source it, Long Island cheese, and see if you don't have more success. I should also mention before I forget that the Tromboncino is a Cucurbita muscata, which makes sense. If you look at it, it looks quite a bit like a long, snaking butternut squash. It can be eaten as a summer squash or a winter squash. I find them a little bit flavorless, but I know several friends who grow them and really enjoy them. Plus, they're just spectacular looking in the garden. Next up, we have the Cucurbita maxima, and this is where my beloved Burgess buttercup squash resides. Not to be confused with butternut, buttercup squash is a green squash that is small and kind of a squat round shape, and oh my goodness, it is the best winter squash. I have made videos just on Burgess buttercup. If you don't grow it in the home garden, I think you are missing out big time. Give it a chance. Best flavor, best small size for a family squash. So besides my beloved Burgess buttercup, what else is in Cucurbita maxima? Well, Hubbard squash, kaboka squash, banana squash, and any of the really giant pumpkins that folks grow for giant pumpkin growing competitions, those are all Cucurbita maxima. So Cucurbita maxima tends to have big vining plants that take up a lot of space in the garden. I recommend you grow them over a trellis or up a fence if you have the opportunity to do so, because they will just go everywhere in your garden. I've seen them grow easily a foot a day in the peak of summer. The last species I want to cover is Cucurbita pepo. This is a really large group with many, many varieties. Most of the summer squash exist in this group. Zucchinis, crookneck squash, yellow summer squash, patty pans, all of those are Cucurbita pepo. But ornamental gourds, of which yellow crookneck is one if you let it get overly mature, are also Cucurbita pepo. Also in Cucurbita pepo is the pumpkin. So the Connecticut field pumpkin, Cucurbita pepo. Now, I will say I am not really generally a fan of the winter squash in the Cucurbita pepo species. I don't find pumpkins and I don't find acorn squash, also in this species, particularly good. I find them stringy and watery and my least favorite kind of winter squash. I grow a lot of Cucurbita pepo as summer squash. By a lot, I mean I usually grow 4 or 5 summer squash plants, and that's 3 or 4 too many for a family. But I do it anyway, and I gift them around and I save a lot of them for winter. I do a lot of shredding and freezing of my zucchinis. Now, I don't want to bash anybody who really loves acorn squash. You can grow what you like and enjoy what you like, but for me, Cucurbita pepo is all about the summer squash, and Cucurbita maxima and Cucurbita moscata, that's where I find my winter squash that I grow and enjoy and save. So the benefits of growing cucurbits: they're very high in vitamin A and vitamin C, particularly the winter squash have a lot of vitamin A. The seeds can be used as a dewormer for livestock, and many varieties of winter squash are grown specifically just for their edible seeds called pepitas for humans to enjoy as well. So they're a rich source of protein. So what's going on when we have weird looking squash or melons? Now, I talked earlier about how we can rest assured that they are not cross-pollinating with each other, that simply growing 2 different species of plants next to each other means that in no way are we going to get hybrid fruit off of either of those plants. If you save the seeds and grow them out the next year, if they are from the same species but different varieties, you will find they will express their genetic diversity and you will get something unique from either of the parents. It won't come true from seed. But what if you aren't growing out seeds that you saved? What's going on if your squash looks weird or your melon looks weird? So the first answer is you may have incomplete pollination. Folks may be growing a really round kind of squash or melon and find that it is wonky shaped and say, oh, this means that it's hybridized. It's actually much more likely that it was incompletely pollinated, and that's why you're not getting the proper symmetry of the fruit. Viruses can also cause discoloration and misshapen fruit, so just be aware that's something that could be contributing to your weird fruit to begin with. If you have volunteers coming up out of your compost that you've spread in the garden, those may well be a hybrid. You may have had your banana squash cross with your kaboka squash last year, and the seeds that come up, they could be anything. Think about how diverse the Cucurbita maxima is, how many varieties exist, huge amount of genetic diversity in that species, and it will express itself in the volunteers you get out of your compost. Now, I just want to make a note here. When you're growing volunteer squash or you're growing squash that has been grown in extremely stressful conditions of low water and high temperature, either of those occurrences can contribute to what's called bitter squash syndrome. That is when the natural cucurbitacin in the cucumbers or the squash are allowed to proliferate due to adverse growing conditions or because of the characteristics of the hybrid. So if you eat a cucumber and it is unpalatably bitter, or you eat a winter squash or summer squash and find that it is distastefully bitter, please don't eat it. Too much cucurbitacin can make you really sick. A tiny little bit of it in your cucumbers lends itself naturally to a little note of bitterness in cucumbers. But if it is such that you don't enjoy eating it, please stop. Please stop and don't eat it. Don't feed it to your livestock. Just go ahead and compost that squash. It just means it's got too much cucurbitacin in it. Go ahead and compost that cucumber. It just means that it has a bitterness that could make you sick, but is safe to compost. So what else can contribute to strange looking squash in our garden where we're not expecting it? And keep in mind that your squash can spread 20, 30 feet. So you may have a summer squash growing here, and back here you have a winter squash. And so you may end up with a strange fruit over here and think, gosh, this is something weird is happening to my zucchini. But what you've actually got is the tendrils of that vine have grown all the way down here, flowered, and you have a winter squash growing in the middle of your summer squash. I have quite a bit of that happening in my garden right now. And because the flowers are really similar color and the leaf structure is really similar, it's easy to get them confused if they are tangled and growing amongst each other. The weird looking squash, if you trace the vine carefully, because squash vines are really brittle, all the way back to the parent, you will find that actually that is a different plant and not the summer squash producing one freak weirdo. For me, by the way, I put a stake in when I plant the seeds of my squash because they do wander so far. That way I know where the beginning of the plant is, and I know where to trace back any of the babies to, and I also know where to water right there at the center where I've put the posts in the garden. A rarer option is that your squash or your cucumber seeds may have been mislabeled. If you bought them off Etsy or off of eBay, who knows what you're going to get. But if you buy them from a reputable seed producer, this is really rare. Occasionally it does happen. I've had this happen once or twice where one or two seeds in a packet might look wonky, and that might be because the way the sorting system worked, where a different variety from the previous round of packaging got left over or stuck in the machines and ended up in with my squash. And sometimes when I've grown them out, I've had some that come a little weird, and that's because despite best efforts to isolate, if you're ordering from a small company, sometimes a pollinator, remember bees can travel 3-4 miles, a pollinator may get in there and cross-pollinate a current year's fruit. So the companies that are selling you seed may rarely have those, but folks want to claim it so often. It just really doesn't happen that often. You're more likely to have one of the other issues that I mentioned earlier. So thank you for watching. Hope you learned a little bit about the 8 distinct species of the Cucurbitaceae, and that you are empowered now to go out in your garden and feel confident in understanding how cross-pollination works, how our cucumbers, our melons, our summer squash, and our winter squash all interact with each other, how you can confidently hand-pollinate to save seed and to get your varieties to come true every year, or that you just want to buy them from the store, buy them from the seed catalog, and grow them next to each other, knowing that you will get what you bought and what you planted. Today, I hope this video was helpful to you and you got something out of it. If so, please consider clicking like and subscribe. Those are 2 easy ways you can help support and promote my channel. If you are interested in contributing on a regular basis to this channel, I have a Patreon down in the description. If you thought, hey, I really like this video, I got something out of it, I got something out of your last 2 or 3 videos, but I can't support you on a monthly basis, you can check out my PayPal, also in the description. Throw a couple bucks at it, that really helps us out. You sponsoring and supporting this channel makes it possible for me to make more videos, and it helps support me and my 4 children on our permaculture journey, so thank you.